I'm Maxwell Hutchinson on the trail of the region's hidden architectural gems. You find me in the heart of Bedfordshire, where this magnificent French-inspired chateau, Rest Park, was built by the rich and powerful de Grey family. The clerk of works was a man called James Cleffin, which may sound like a Frenchman, but in fact he hailed from Stockton-on-Tees. Well, that's enough about the house. It isn't actually what I've come to see. Splendid though it is, it's hardly hidden. There's something very special, however, at the end of the garden, which in a place like this is more than a little stroll, it's half a mile. The gardens at Rest Park were laid out in the early 18th century and were inspired by the great gardens of the Palace of Versailles. They're extremely well preserved and a rare example of the formal style, because while it was extremely popular at the time, it soon fell out of favour when Capability Brown's more natural English-looking landscapes became all the rage. Amiaketwai owi umla ia campankia. This was always intended to be a garden of surprises. And when Jemima, Marchioness de Grey, was in charge of the place in the middle of the 18th century, she'd bring all her posh, intellectual friends down here to see this ancient Greek altar that's dedicated to Mithras, the god of the sun. And she would invite them to translate the strange Greek and Persian symbols. But obviously, she and her husband had a great sense of humour, because in fact, it's all a complete load of rubbish. The altar was in fact brand new, and the writing just something made up by Jemima and her husband. But whether she ever told her learned friends this after they'd spent hours studying and trying to look knowledgeable, who's to say? Now, this is where Jemima allowed Capability Brown to bring just a little of his more natural style of gardening to Rest Park. The canal is called the Long Water and is one of the earliest features. Originally, it would have been designed to look very formal, rather artificial in fact. But when Brown came along, he softened the edges to make them look more like a river. Well, there you are, that's half a mile, and you can see the house in the background, looking particularly beautiful in that light. But this is what I've come to see, our hidden treasure, a pleasure pavilion. This splendid structure was built around 1710 and was designed by one of the most famous architects of his day, Thomas Archer. In the Baroque style and with its grand dome, it might have been inspired by the great Italian cathedrals Archer would have seen during his years of study and travel in Europe. The entire family and all their friends would decamp down here for wonderful parties and sumptuous banquets, which of course the servants absolutely hated because they had to bring the food all the way from the house. It was only really used in the summer because can you imagine that long walk across the sticky Bedfordshire clay? One woman tried it and lost her shoe, and she had to go through the indignity of borrowing one from the gamekeeper's wife. And this is the party room. The Baroque wall paintings are by a man called Louis Odoy, a Huguenot who fled to England to escape persecution in France at the turn of the 18th century. This is the single remaining example of his work. The only other paintings known to be by him are in a private house in Lincolnshire, but unfortunately, when this sort of style went out of fashion, they were unceremoniously painted over and can no longer be seen. Off the main hall, there are two bedchambers. This is the most luxurious, and it was probably for a woman, because it has a mirror above the mantelpiece and a beautiful early Georgian fireplace. It's possible that being a discreet distance from the main house, entertaining of a slightly naughty nature might have been going on here in the pleasure pavilion. Beneath the main chamber is this huge kitchen with great big open fires where an army of servants would have laboured away. For their amusement, they could eavesdrop on the conversation and goings-on above. Because the de Grey family decided to retain the formality of this early part of the garden, some visitors in later decades thought it horribly out of date. Horace Walpole described the garden as very ugly in the old-fashioned manner, with high hedges and canals, at the end of the principal one of which is a frightful temple. What a cheek the man had! Over a century later, the tastes in landscape gardening had changed. Just a few miles away, near the village of Old Warton, an extraordinary project was underway to create a little bit of the Swiss Alps, right here in the heart of Bedfordshire. This Swiss garden was the brainchild of the young aristocrat Robert Henry Oundle. In the 19th century, after all the shenanigans with Napoleon were over at last, it became the thing to visit Switzerland. As Jane Austen put it, her friends were frisking off there like half of England. Now, most people came back with predictable souvenirs, cowbells and little model chalets, but for Lord Oundle, it had to be something better. He recreated a life-sized Swiss cottage. This is a brilliant example of the 19th century love of the picturesque, setting buildings into an artificially created landscape to draw the eye or entice the visitor to explore further. Just look at all this decoration, twisted twigs, pine cones and teasels. It doesn't get much more rustic than that. Now, a story at the time had it that Lord Oundle used to keep a Swiss mistress here. What rot. Why would a wealthy aristocrat, with everything he had around him, want to keep a lady friend here in a drafty summer house? It was just an apocryphal story. The idea of the picturesque garden was to see landscape through the eyes of a painter, creating set pieces, vistas framed by overhanging trees or overhead arches, and to give a feeling of seclusion, a sense of distance from the outside world. This is a typical feature of the picturesque garden, and Lord Oundle would have ordered it from a pattern book. I'll have a number 17, a tree seat with a thatched roof. It was somewhere to sit and contemplate the view. It came complete with a melancholic poem to put you in the mood of lost love. Lord Oundle loved to entertain, and in keeping with his Tyrol theme, he would employ women from the village to help out at his parties, insisting that they wear traditional Swiss costume of red cloaks and tall hats. Of course, if you invite lots of visitors, you need to provide certain facilities. But even the privy had been designed in charming rustic mode. Lord Oundle was an eccentric aristocrat who really liked to have fun. He built these ironwork walkways at high level so his guests could enjoy the garden at the level of the canopy of the trees. And then sometimes he would hide up there to eavesdrop on their conversations below to see exactly what they thought of it. Now, you may be of the opinion that I should have brought you to a garden on a lovely sunny day. Not so. This is an architectural garden, not a horticultural one. The rather melancholy feel of a day like this is just what Lord Oundle was after. No colourful flower beds for him. Flowers were for municipal parks. Now, of course, no picturesque garden would be complete without a grotto. Down a dark, intriguing passageway, you suddenly find yourself beneath this beautiful glass dome. When the wealthy Shuttleworth family bought the estate in the 1870s, they held many a party in here, installing lanterns, divan beds, Turkish rugs, and even hookah pipes to add a truly exotic feel. By the 1860s, the enthusiasm for all things Swiss, alpine and picturesque had come to the end. The Swiss gardens at Old Warden now welcome visitors. This eccentric oasis of peace and quiet provides an opportunity to travel back to the 19th century, when picturesque gardening and ornamental architecture came together. I've moved on to Northamptonshire, where my next story begins. Rushton Hall was one of the principal homes of a most extraordinary man. Sir Thomas Tresham, born in 1545, was a knight, a vast landowner, a builder, and most important of all, a devout Roman Catholic. Pretty bad news for somebody living under the Protestant reign of Queen Elizabeth I. During his lifetime, Sir Thomas spent a total of 15 years in prison and paid a total of £7,717, 12 shillings in fines, a vast amount of money. Now, was Sir Thomas put off? Was he tempted to give up his Roman Catholic faith altogether? No, and exactly to the contrary. He was determined to celebrate it in a most strange and mysterious way. On his return to Rushton Hall in 1593, after yet another spell at Her Majesty's pleasure, he set about designing one of the strangest and bravest buildings in Britain, and he built it just a mile away. The Elizabethans loved a puzzle, and Sir Thomas decided to create a puzzle of a building. This triangular lodge is giving out a covert message. A message which, at the time, would have been regarded as quite outrageous. It's built of the local Northamptonshire limestone on the edge of what used to be a huge rabbit warren. Despite his religious enthusiasms, Sir Thomas was a good businessman. After all, he had to be to pay all those fines and spend all that time in prison. So he decided to farm the rabbits and send them down to London. It has been said that the man who looked after the rabbits, the Warrener of Rushton, lived in the triangular lodge. But whether it had any practical use is perhaps irrelevant. What is startlingly clear is that Sir Thomas was fixated by the number 3. 3 sides, each one 33 feet in length.
3 windows.
3 gables. Inside, there are 3 floors. There's even a 3-sided chimney. The beautifully carved emblems are all in 3s or multiples of 3. Along the top of every one of the 3 33-foot-long sides is an inscription, each with 33 letters. A perfectly acceptable explanation would be that the 3-leaved plant called the trefoil was the Tresham family emblem, hence the significance of this particular number. But the less acceptable truth was that the triangular lodge was a Catholic celebration of the Holy Trinity. Sir Thomas was expressing his passion for his forbidden faith, secretly and in stone. Sir Thomas Tresham was loyal to Queen Elizabeth I, but because he was a practicing Roman Catholic in what was now a Protestant country, he was either imprisoned or under surveillance for 12 years. When he finally returned to his beloved Northamptonshire, he started work on this amazing and very brave building. Just a few miles east of here is another one of Sir Thomas's remarkable creations. As well as Rushton Hall, Sir Thomas Tresham had a second main residence, here at Liveden near Oundle. He may have been a devout Catholic, but he enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. Much of his wealth came from sheep farming, when over 6,000 sheep would have grazed in these fields.
He also enjoyed entertaining. In 1 year alone, he and his guests consumed 50 cattle and 200 sheep. So he decided in 1595 to build a grand banqueting house. Now, like the triangular lodge, it was full of complexity, puzzles and enigma. But unlike the triangular lodge, it was never finished.
Liveden New Bield, as it was called, was to form the centrepiece of an ornate pleasure garden where Sir Thomas and his guests would decamp for days at a time. Today, the garden, itself a hidden treasure, is beginning to reveal its secrets. Mark Bradshaw is property manager here.
Presumably the house didn't sit in blissful isolation in the middle of a field, did it?
No, not at all. In fact, the building was just the very end point of a whole sequence of pleasure grounds to lead up to it. You know, this was the finale. This was the place for lavish entertainment. Tresham was a real great entertainer, probably one of the best in the county, and the building was the party house for that.
Well, how did they get here then?
Well, they would have come up from the main house at the bottom of the hill, through the orchard, onto their boats, onto their punts, and then gradually coming round and coming off onto these banks, onto these mounts.
So what are the mounts for?
Well, the mounts really were for the ladies. You imagine you've got your long flowing farthingale dress on and whalebone breastplates. Very difficult to go up steps, so this gradual ascent would take you gracefully up to the summit of the mount, where you could enjoy the splendour of the views, looking over your deer park, looking over the canals, looking over the formality of the garden as well.
That's my idea of a party.
At the centre was this splendid banqueting hall. Kitchens were built with huge fireplaces, bedchambers for guests, and right at the top of the house, with its wonderful view over the parkland, the grandest of the rooms, the banqueting hall. Of course, all we see now is the shell of the building, but all these walls would have been plastered or panelled in the finest English oak.
Now, were there ever joists put up here? You can see the holes where the ends would have been. Were there joists?
You can, in fact, you can see up there some of the joists, and that's where they've receded over the years. They were cut out during the Civil War, so the joists were in place when work stopped here in 1605 until the Civil War, and Cromwell's men came along, cut out the joists, took them to Oundle, which is, 5 miles away, and they were sold by public auction and used in the building works of Oundle School.
Well, I went to Oundle School, but I still think it's a very mean thing to have done. So what's through here, underneath this arch? They must have been very short.
They would have done. Of course, the servants were much shorter. You know, they'd be carrying 100-weight sacks from the age of 6, and this is believed to really stunt your growth. You know, farmers today will say that tall people never worked hard during their youth, and probably the case.
But remember, this is a building by Sir Thomas Tresham, so its primary, if secret purpose was to celebrate the Catholic faith. It's in the shape of a cross, and everywhere you see emblems and inscriptions.
Around the top we have religious scriptures. These are from the Vulgate, the Catholic Bible, verses in praise of the Virgin Mary. Around the middle we then have this elaborate frieze-work depicting scenes, this sort of Doric frieze-work depicting scenes of the crucifixion or the passion of Christ. So you've got symbols like the 30 pieces of silver in Judas's leather bag. You've got the arrest of Christ in the garden and the symbols there. You've got the crucifixion itself. Tresham's guests would mainly have been Catholics. His friends here would
So
have
for
been
them they could read
Catholics.
this like a book?
Absolutely. And not only in that symbolism, but the calculations of the building as well. The 3, the 5, each bay with 5 sides, each being 5 foot.
What, the 5 wounds of Christ?
The 5 wounds of Christ, yeah. And the 3, of course, the Trinity. All this symbolism, some obvious, some needing a little bit of working out. And of course, the more they looked, the more they found out.
So if you want to study Elizabethan masonry and the way it was all put together, this is a wonderful example, isn't it?
It is, because you sort of see it in its carcass form. We haven't got the rendering, we haven't got the oak panelling coming across these walls. We can still see what were called the put log holes to put the log in. We have it in scaffolding today.
Yeah.
And of course, to put the log in and to build up your scaffolding, and these of course would have been filled with stones and then rendered over or oak panelled. So we're seeing it in its raw state, and it gives us a lot of clues and a clear understanding of the methods of building of that time.
I'd love to live here.
Amazing, isn't it? Come in at night time, it's even better.
Sir Thomas died in 1605, leaving behind him debts of £11,000. His eldest son, Francis, as a Roman Catholic, became involved in the gunpowder plot, as a result of which he was incarcerated in the Tower of London, where he died in the same year. So Sir Thomas's plans for all of this never came to fruition.
No doors were hung, no glass put into the windows, no roof was ever added, and the parties never took place.
Centuries later, the Victorians, who loved a ruin, could travel here by train to nearby Oundle station. Then, for sixpence, they could hire a chisel and a hammer and carve their names into the wall.
Throughout the years of imprisonment and crippling fines, Sir Thomas refused to give up his Catholic faith. And these strange and wonderful buildings stand as testament to the devotion of one of the most intriguing figures in English history.